Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that in traditional Stanford fashion, we will likely have some stragglers coming in. It is my great pleasure to make the introduction of our guest today. I'm Dan Siciliano, professor here at the law school. I teach venture capital and finance, but also have a background in U.S. immigration reform and came from that area of the practice of law. I'm with the Rock Center, who's hosting this event, and a special thanks to Evan Epstein, who's put this together. It is my pleasure to introduce Jason Kenney. Let me just take a couple seconds to tell you a few things about him before I have him stand up and talk to us about the topic today. Jason Kenney is the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration, and Multiculturalism for Canada. And he is originally from the Canadian House of Commons as a function of that, but more importantly, he is someone who has demonstrated a long-term commitment to sophisticated understanding of issues of growth and population and immigration. And I assume, I can only make this assumption on my own behalf, that that is why he holds the position now, and more importantly, why perhaps he has brought forward a very creative solution which borrows, ironically, from things that have been in part chatted about in the United States for a long time, but not enacted. So I'll be interested to hear him talk about that large advantage. I would like to point out that he was born in Oakville, Ontario, and I always try to say one thing that no one will have known about unless they looked up some obscure references, and I had to get some help for this one. He is the grandson of the famed jazz musician and big band leader, Mart Kenney. So thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over, let the minister speak, and we'll do some questions at the end, if that's okay with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the warm welcome on what we call Victoria Day in Canada, which is a charming anachronism. It's a statutory holiday when we celebrate the official birthday of our sovereign, Queen Elizabeth II, on the actual birthday of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, otherwise known as the day on the weekend on which Canadians go out to the cottage and drink too much beer. But I'm here today. You know, I'm reminded that Michael Kinsley, when he was editor of The New Republic in the mid-'80s, ran a competition amongst his readers to determine the world's most boring headline. And they received hundreds of submissions from New Republic readers around the world, and the ultimate winner was Worthwhile Canadian Initiative. As Kinsley wrote, each of the three words is sleep-inducing on its own, but taken together they are virtually lethal. So brace yourselves, I'm here to talk about a worthwhile Canadian initiative. Our immigration reforms, and more particularly our startup visa. I should also like to acknowledge and thank our Consul General for San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, Cassie Doyle, for being here as a very distinguished public servant from Canada. And it's a great pleasure also today to meet Vivek Wadhwa, whose research on immigration as a magnet for entrepreneurship I'm very familiar with. So, I'm here to talk about Canada's immigration system and more specifically our efforts to more aggressively attract the world's best and brightest. I have a wonderful job and I've had it for nearly 5 years. Every year I get to welcome hundreds of thousands of newcomers who want to bring their talents and their strengths, their work ethic to Canada. And there are a lot of wonderful things happening in Canada, which is why they want to come. We have one of the strongest and most stable economies in the developed world. So please bear with me as I do something very uncharacteristic for a Canadian. We're supposed to be very self-effacing and humble, but I'm going to spend a few minutes boasting about Canada, for which I apologize sincerely. Canada has emerged from the 2008-9 global economic downturn having one of the strongest and most stable economies in the developed world. In fact, we've had the best job creation record in the developed world since the downturn. During the downturn itself, we had the shortest and shallowest recession of any of the major developed economies, I think with the exception of Australia. Since the downturn, we've seen the creation of nearly 1 million net new jobs, which is about 3 times more than have been created in the United States on a per capita basis over the same period. And if you actually were to measure Canada's unemployment rate the same way the United States does, we would have about 6.2% unemployment, significantly more than 2 points lower than in the United States. We have the strongest fiscal position of the major developed economies. And this is new, by the way. This weekend I was meeting quite a few expat Canadians at the TICON conference in Santa Clara, a number of whom had come down to Canada a couple of decades ago when brain drain was one of our highest profile economic challenges. A lot of bright young Canadian entrepreneurs and professionals left a Canadian economy that was at the time slow moving, quite rigid, with very high taxes, and generally a perception that it was of an economy with fewer opportunities than in the United States and elsewhere. Both of my older brothers came down to live in the United States, so many families know the Canadian story of brain drain very well. But now we're living through a period of brain gain. Many of those expat Canadians are coming back, and we are seeing a growing interest in international investment in Canada. Forbes magazine has said for 2 years running that Canada is the best place in the G20 in which to start a new business. And this is in part because of our low tax environment. We now have the lowest taxes on new business investment in the G20. Our corporate taxes are on average, depending on which province or state you live in, they're on average 13 points lower than in the United States. Our capital gains taxes, surprisingly, are lower than in the United States, which should be a big draw, for example, entrepreneurs and startups that want eventually to exit from their investments. So there are a lot of remarkable advantages. According to KPMG, overall business costs in Canada are the second lowest in the G7 and 5 points lower than in the United States. And KPMG also ranks Canada as the most tax-competitive country in the G7. This is all possible in part because we've spent 15 years focusing on getting our fiscal house in order. Back in the early to mid-90s, we had the worst fiscal situation in the developed world, the largest debt-to-GDP ratio, one of the largest deficit-to-GDP ratios. Our deficit is now the lowest in the G7, one of the lowest in the developed world. We're on track for a balanced budget within a couple of years. I gather you're going to have a hard time getting a balanced budget within a couple of decades in the United States by comparison. We take no pleasure in the difference. And we have the lowest debt levels per capita, at the national level at least, in the G7. So, in addition to which, of course, we have a high standard of living, high quality of life, high quality public education, many Canadian universities that are as good as many of the top-flight American universities, but at a fraction of the cost. And all of these are reasons why, for example, the CEO of Cisco Systems, John Chambers, recently said that, quotes, "The easiest place in the world to do business is Canada. Their prime minister gets it. They make it easy for me to invest and do acquisitions there. They have a great education program, and they have a great immigration policy," close quotes. I'll take credit for that. Speaking of our immigration policy, Fareed Zakaria did an interesting documentary on Canada's immigration policy and its success on CNN last year. He also wrote a couple of articles in Time magazine in which he said that Canada is a nation that now has the most successful set of immigration policies in the world. Canada's economy is thriving because it actively seeks immigrants to fill labor gaps and then grants those immigrants the full benefits and opportunities of being Canadian, close quote. So I hear the same thing from a steady stream of European ministers who come to Canada to study what they think is a model for immigration policy and integration of newcomers. And I've certainly been my phone has been virtually ringing off the hook in the past few months as policymakers and think tanks in the United States and Washington ask us for the benefit of our experience. And they're right to be interested because the Canadian immigration model has many great successes. We have the primary economic immigrants that we select, those who we select according to their human capital, do quite well. Usually after 5 to 10 years, they're making at or above the average income in Canada. Immigration is fueling innovation. Now, we don't have exactly the same kind of robust research that Vivek and his colleagues have been doing with respect to the linkage between immigration and innovation, but we do know that 35% of university research chairs are foreign-born versus 20% of the Canadian population being foreign-born. Immigrants are, in terms of entrepreneurship, quite intuitively, immigrants in Canada, like in the United States, are more likely than native-born people to start new businesses. And generally speaking, the children of immigrants do quite well. Statistics Canada said that second-generation Canadians, that the children of immigrants, are much more likely to have a university degree. Their incidence of reliance on government transfer payments and their rates of employment and unemployment are no different, and their average earnings are higher than those young adults of Canadian-born parents. So that's the positive picture. But I'm going to offer a caveat here, which is that as much as I'd like to propose that the Canadian immigration system is perfect, in fact, it has a lot of weaknesses and has, in many respects, been underperforming for the last 4 decades. In fact, we have seen overall, over the past 4 decades, a decline, constant, steady decline in relative incomes for immigrants. Speaking of the second generation, well, I mentioned generally they do better. There are certain cohorts of second-gen immigrants who actually do very poorly, who tend to be stuck in the bottom of the labor market and in terms of household incomes. The labor force participation rate amongst immigrants is counterintuitively quite a lot lower than for the average population. The unemployment rate for new immigrants is twice as high as the general unemployment rate. The unemployment rate for new immigrants with university degrees is 4 to 5 times higher than it is for people born in Canada with university degrees. A couple of academics working with the Fraser Institute, a think tank, have calculated that there is a net fiscal transfer to immigrants in Canada of $6,100 a year. So when all fiscal benefits and taxes paid are accounted for, actually, they estimate in this study that immigrants represent a net fiscal cost to the Canadian economy of about $16 billion a year. And a lot of this is, a lot of these challenges are because many of the immigrants we receive are people with higher levels of education from developed countries who have great difficulty in getting their education or professional experience recognized and to get accredited. That leads to the joke that the safest place in the world in which to have a heart attack is the back of a taxi cab in Toronto, because the chances are that your driver is a cardiac surgeon. And in fact, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is now shooting a mini-series about a taxi driver who's a medical doctor, runs a pharmacy out of his cab. And this has become like a figment of popular imagination, and it's all too true. Too many highly educated people from developing countries finding themselves stuck in survival jobs at the bottom of our labor market, which is a real paradox in an economy whose primary challenge now is that of skill and labor shortages. It makes no sense for us to invite tens of thousands of educated professionals from around the world into an economy with labor shortages only to face unemployment or underemployment. And our immigration system has become dysfunctional in many ways. Quite frankly, we have a popular immigration myth in Canada's political culture, which is great. We are the only developed country, well, let me rephrase that. We are the developed country which has by far the most positive general public attitude towards immigration. About 8 out of 10 Canadians say that generally immigration is a net benefit for the country. But when you probe a little bit deeper, you see a lot of warning signs going off. You see Canadians actually want to cut immigration levels, a significant plurality of them do. You see a certain anxiety, a certain skepticism, because, for example, we ended up with a backlog of 1 million people in our system waiting for 8 years. It was just frankly poorly managed. And there were growing problems in terms of integrity challenges. You know, I agree with Thomas Friedman's idea that an ideal immigration system in a developed democracy should have high walls but a broad gate. And Canadians began to get the impression with human smuggling, various forms of immigration fraud, large waves of unfounded asylum claims, etc., that our system was more porous than characterized by integrity. And that, I think, if you don't mind this observation, is the obvious problem with the political debate on immigration in the United States. When most people think of, when they hear the term immigration, they initially associate that with illegal migration, that massively undermines public confidence in legal migration. So we're trying to get that right. That's why we are undertaking a comprehensive program of reform in our immigration system to do a much better job of selecting people with relevant human capital that is relevant to the Canadian economy. Now, for example, many of those cab driving doctors, we never assessed the quality of their degrees when we selected them. We just did a very kind of crude attribution of points based on the quantity of people's post-secondary education rather than its quality or relevance to the Canadian professional standards. So we're changing that. As of last month, we've begun requiring that all applicants for our points system, our federal skilled worker program, must submit a pre-assessment of their international education conducted by an expert body that has been designated by my ministry. So, because in the past we were giving the same points to the Indian Institute of Technology as the dodgiest degree mill in India. So is it at all surprising that we ended up with a lot of people who were professionals on paper who weren't actually close to the Canadian standard? This will radically improve the overall human capital of the immigrants who we select. We're also working to better connect our labor market with prospective immigrants. We're adopting what the Australians and Kiwis have done called an expression of interest system, a huge pool of interested prospective immigrants who will be pre-qualified, and we will then invite registered employers and our provincial governments to go into that pool to select people who have the kinds of skills that they need. We've also, 4 years ago, created a pathway for foreign students after their graduation to stay in Canada permanently. We give them 3-year open work permits, and then if they maintain employment for 12 months, we give them permanent residency. We've achieved a much better geographic distribution of immigrants across Canada. One of the problems we had was that 80% were going to the 3 biggest metropolitan areas, even though those typically were not where the best employment prospects were. We have full employment and big skills shortages in our prairie Midwest, for example, and as a result of the giving regional governments the ability to select a certain number of immigrants, we've seen immigration fall, annual immigration levels to the 3 biggest cities, Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, has fallen dramatically, while it has tripled on the Canadian prairies and doubled on our in our East Coast provinces. We've introduced a new points grid, which places greater emphasis on younger applicants, those with higher levels of language proficiency, and those with Canadian work experience. We, as I say, are moving towards a radically new system, this kind of expression of interest model that was adopted by Australia last year and New Zealand about 8 years ago. Now, just to wrap up, one of the reforms involves doing a much better job of attracting entrepreneurs, people with the kind of ingenuity and entrepreneurial drive that really is the great engine for wealth creation in modern economies. And that's why last month we launched something called the Startup Visa. Many of you will be familiar with the concept. There's been a lobby to have the United States create a pathway to at least temporary, and perhaps then eventually permanent residency for entrepreneurs involved, for example, in startup businesses. Now, you all know the problem here in the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley, tens of thousands of brilliant young foreign nationals on H-1 visas who cannot get their green cards. They have to leave the country if they can't get there in order to come back on their new H-1s. Sometimes they run into the wall in terms of the H-1 quota. I talked to dozens and dozens of these bright young people at the TICON conference on the weekend. All of the ones I spoke with were from South Asia, primarily India. I spoke to people who had been in the U.S., one guy who'd been here for 12 years but couldn't get his green card even though he was running a successful business, and he just said, I'm fed up with waiting. How do I get to Canada? So I said, thanks, you're the kind of guy I want to talk to. The new Startup Visa invites foreign entrepreneurs who can attract a $200,000 investment from a certified Canadian venture capital fund or a $75,000 investor from a certified angel investor to get permanent residency in Canada. They just have to have they have to have 1 year post-secondary, very generous consideration of the dropout factor. They have to have enough money in the bank to take care of themselves for a year, basically $10,000 if they're an individual, speak intermediate English or French, and not have a criminal record. I often tell them if they do have a criminal record, they can apply for Australia. That's a mandatory requirement. Sorry, I just had to throw that out there. I said that in Ireland. I was doing a jobs fair, and that was well received. This has gotten tremendous interest. As I told you, it's uncharacteristic of us Canadians to be boastful and aggressive. Again, with my apologies, we're doing just that. We put up a billboard on the highway near the San Francisco airport to say, are you having H-1B visa problems? Pivot to Canada, lower taxes, startup visa. So the message is, in sum, that Canada has this big, generous immigration program. We're trying to make it work much better for our modern economy, one aspect of which is we want to be a magnet for people with the highest levels of human capital in this increasingly competitive global marketplace for human talent, and we believe this will succeed in collaboration with both Canadian and U.S. venture capitalists and angel investors. So, frankly, I know there's a debate. There's a virtual march on Washington later this week for the startup visa. There's a very active debate on comprehensive immigration reform in Washington. As partners of the United States, we always hope the U.S. gets it right. But if you don't, we're willing to take your best and brightest. So happy to take any questions you have.
Hi, thanks for coming. My name is Ari Siegel. I'm a third-year student in the JD MBA program here. I just have two short questions since no one else had one.
Sure.
First, how are you thinking about security issues? There's obviously rising kind of ethnocentrism in the wake of global terrorism, the recent Boston bombing, so I'm curious how you're balancing those issues. And then second, and completely unrelated, in addition to wanting to attract immigrant talent, I assume that underlying that policy is a conclusion that the Canadian government's reached more broadly, that entrepreneurship is a great way to boost the Canadian economy. So I'm wondering how you think about immigration as a way to achieve that goal versus other policies, lower capital gains tax, easier access to credit, et cetera.
Sure. On the second question, it's not a binary choice. As I said, we went through 15 years of getting our fiscal house in order, which, that just kind of rolls off the tongue, but it was really difficult political work, structural reform to bring our budgets generally into balance, to begin reducing the stock of public debt, and make strategic investments in the Canadian economy, as we've done, for example, with large investments in our research infrastructure at our post-secondary institutions. But part of that was to get our taxes down, because we were way behind the curve in the developed world on our tax structure. And we've done that. As I said, we now have substantially lower business taxes than in the U.S. That was not easy to do. I mean, Canada's political culture is to the left of the United States. So when my party stood up in successive elections and said we were continuing to cut corporate taxes, we were demagogued by people from the Socialist Party, for example, saying that this was a giveaway to the 1%. And so it was not, it took, frankly, political courage and it took long-term vision to stick to that agenda, to get our corporate taxes down to a point where they are amongst the lowest in the developed world and substantially lower in the United States. And we did the same thing with capital gains. Our capital gains rates are lower than in the U.S. Specifically, in terms of incenting entrepreneurship, we have a very generous tax credit for eligible salaries in STEM industries. So we actually will give a refundable tax credit to Canadian-owned and controlled businesses to write off, to rebate up to 35% of the salary costs for STEM work, like for IT engineers. Some provinces add another credit on top of that. So in some provinces, like I think British Columbia, a Canadian-controlled IT startup can write off 50% or can get a credit for 50% of their engineering costs I had a Canadian venture capitalist tell me on the weekend that this meant that effectively, because also the wage rates are somewhat lower in that industry, there's less demand than there is in the United States, is that effectively the labor costs, for example, in IT startups in Canada can be a quarter of what it is in the United States. So lower effective labor costs, lower taxes, and a great quality of life. What's not to like? And by the way, one big structural difference is that if you leave, for example, a major employer in the United States and go out to start your own business, you typically lose your health insurance. In Canada, for example, the people who qualify for this visa program will get their immediate Canadian equivalent to a green card, with which comes access to government comprehensive universal health insurance. So I think overall, in addition to all of that, various provincial governments have done a lot to incent particular industries. Quebec, for example, is has large incentives for digital media. British Columbia has the same, which is why Disney has set up a business there. So look, those are all structural things, quite apart from immigration. But we do see immigration as, with our shrinking, we have the same demographic challenges as the United States. In fact, we have a much lower birth rate. And so we do see immigration as an essential part of our response to the aging of the population and the shrinking of the workforce. And of course, immigrants tend to be are more likely to be entrepreneurs than native-born Canadians. So we see immigration and these kinds of immigration programs as supporting our broader strategy for innovation and entrepreneurship. On the first question, I didn't get into this, but actually, part of our immigration reforms involve dramatic improvements in our immigration security screening for reasons that you've identified. Actually, recently, in the last couple of months, we've had a critical number of incidents that have raised the consciousness of Canadians about national security, about immigration security. We've had 2 kids born in Canada that became radicalized, went to Algeria, and were involved in the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist attack on the gas plant there, killing dozens of people. We had a Canadian citizen of Lebanese origin go to Bulgaria, who he apparently planned and helped to execute the bombing of a Israeli tour bus in Bulgaria last year. We've just had the arrest of 3 foreign nationals who were either students or, in one case, a refugee in Canada who were planning to derail a passenger train going from New York to Toronto. And I can assure you, these are not, there's a lot of other suspects that our intelligence and police agencies track. So we are not immune. And believe it or not, Osama bin Laden actually specified Canada as one of, I think, his 5 or 6 target countries. We are by no means immune to the same kind of national security risks that the United States faces. But, to be honest, there is a certain kind of naivete in Canadian political culture. We think, we're somehow immune from all of that, which is why in the post-9/11 environment there was a reluctance to actually make significant policy changes or investments in security infrastructure. We're moving beyond that now. We're just about to launch our new biometric visa requirement, which the US, Australia, the UK have, where we will then implement an electronic travel authorization system for visa-exempt nationals traveling to Canada, which is like a virtual visa, essentially, that will exempt US citizens. We have fixed what was a broken refugee determination or asylum system, where tens of thousands of manifestly fake claimants were coming and staying for years, undermining the integrity of our system. I've signed an information sharing agreement with the United States so that we'll be sharing these, bouncing these both biographic and biometric data on visa applicants against U.S. databases. We've strengthened our laws for the deportation of serious foreign criminals and so forth. This stuff is not about xenophobia. This is about reinforcing public support for legal immigration. If Canadians get the impression that migration generally undermines national security, it will undermine public support for it. And I think my single most important responsibility is to maintain robust public support for immigration, reinforcing the integrity of the system, making sure that there are not holes in the walls around the broad gate is critical.
Hi, my name's Jen. I was a participant in the Startup Chile program.
Oh.
So from that experience, I noticed that it's really hard to go to a new country, not only as an immigrant, but as an entrepreneur. In addition to the services that you provide for general new immigrants, do you have any plans for a soft landing program for entrepreneurs, whether it's mentorship, et cetera? And then secondarily, I've been really excited about this program and telling a lot of my friends who are struggling with U.S. immigration issues that are entrepreneurs. And one common pushback I've heard is, but everything's happening in Silicon Valley. So how do you plan to overcome that?
Thank you. On the first question, we already have a pretty robust system to provide integration support to newcomers. For example, new permanent residents can access free government-funded English or French language courses. Typically, the primary economic immigrants don't need that. They're too busy to take it, but often their spouses or refugees or others do, and that helps to accelerate their integration. We also provide a bunch of services like job search skills. We are also supporting, with the private sector, mentorship programs, some of which have been hugely successful. We've also launched a program with financial institutions and nonprofits to provide for microcredit loans to foreign-trained professionals so they can finance additional tuition or fees to get additional courses, diplomas, so that they can qualify for certification in their licensed profession. They can also use that money to pay for certification exams. So, for example, I met a fellow who had been a CFO in Dubai, came to Canada, was working for $9 an hour at a corner store, but thanks to a $5,000 microcredit loan that he got through our support, he managed to get recognized as an accountant, as a financial manager, and is making six figures in a gas company in Calgary. So we have a lot of success stories like that. But to be honest, all of our efforts to provide support are pretty modest in the context of 20% of our population that's foreign-born, and the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who are underemployed. So we'll continue to provide those kinds of integration supports, but the best thing we can do is to fix the broken aspects of our immigration system so that those we select are much less likely to find themselves at the bottom of the labor market. Oh, and the second question was on the Silicon Valley. Well, look, Canada's never going to have the big brand that the United States does. Our universities, no matter how good they are or get, will never have the same cachet as some of the top-flight American universities. And we will never be able to replicate the dynamism or the size of Silicon Valley. But, so we have to be realistic about that. But we do have we're reaching a point, I think, of critical mass in our venture capital industry, in the startup sector. You can see this in, for example, Waterloo, which is a university town an hour outside of Toronto. The University of Waterloo engineering faculty is a great 5-year co-op program that's spitting out a lot of brilliant STEM and IT engineers. We have major employers there like Research in Motion / BlackBerry, OpenText, and now 800 IT employers in that one medium-sized city alone, with successful young startup entrepreneurs who are exiting with modest fortunes, and they're then becoming angel investors. So we're starting to see the kind of dynamic of Silicon Valley take hold in parts of Canada in a more modest way, obviously. We see this visa as being a key strategy to help accelerate that. The venture capital industry is very excited about this. So, yes, so, we're never going to compete with, but, people say they have to be in the Silicon Valley. I don't know, many of these products are online. They're concerned about not working in the same time zone. Look, you can fly to Vancouver, the flight's less than 2 hours, 10 direct nonstops from San Francisco and San Jose every day, just straight north of here. We've welcomed digital media companies that are working with Hollywood from Europe, for example, that are located in Victoria and Vancouver. And, when they need to come down here, they can. They're on the same time zone. And by the way, arguably a higher standard of living, better quality public education for their kids, government health insurance, and lower business taxes. What's not to like? Stacy.
Adjustment. Full disclosure, I'm from Winnipeg, so I'm actually very interested in
well, Winnipeg / Victoria / Salt Spring Island, right?
I'm a researcher now at the Stanford Archaeology Center. And my question relates to whether or not the program is limited in any way based on where you indicate you want to live. And is there a quota system per province? Is there a limit on the number of visas that would be granted to Ontario? And are there more visas available for people who want to go to Winnipeg, et cetera?
The answer is no. We have a limit on the overall number of startup visas we can issue each year, which is 2,700, because it's a pilot program, but they can go and live anywhere. And we anticipate most would probably end up in the key tech corridors, which are Waterloo / Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. But they can go wherever they want. We do, some of our provinces do now have the power to select, or they all have some limited power to select economic immigrants, and some of them have their own entrepreneurship programs, but they tend to be focused on people starting like conventional small businesses. By the way, there's someone else from Salt Spring Island here.
I was wondering whether you're aiming this program at all at U.S. citizens?
Could you repeat?
Are you interested in getting U.S. citizens through this
program?
Oh,
of course, yes. We'll even take Americans. They're all welcome. This is not limited to people from any country of origin, of course. In fact, the United States is, I think, our 5th largest source country for immigrants. So absolutely, we're more than happy to welcome U.S. citizens.
Hi, my name is Rob. I'm an investor here in Silicon Valley, and last year the Canadian dollar eclipsed the U.S. dollar, and there's a story about how Canadians were richer than Americans. I was wondering what the social and political implications are for that. Second question is, Canada, despite touting multiculturalism, has had an ugly history of racism against Asians, and that's a big issue up in Vancouver. So with this initiative of bringing in highly educated and at some point, I guess, very wealthy Asians, or immigrants in general, how are we going to finesse that issue with
sorry, what was the first question? About,
well,
it was just a comment.
You're going to be encouraging immigrants to come in. They'll be highly educated. At some point, they'll be, well, have a higher success level than native-born Canadians, and you're going to have some social tensions.
Yeah.
We've had that in the past in Canada.
Right.
How are you going to finesse those issues?
Yes, you're right. Canada did have in some respects, a race-based immigration system. Prior to the Second World War, we had an exclusion, what was called the Exclusion Act for Chinese migrants, for example, for which the government has formally apologized and for which it has done a redress to those who were affected. But look, I think we're way past that. We just had our major census released last week, which indicated that 1.5 million new permanent residents have come to Canada in the past, since 2006, which happens to be since Prime Minister Harper's government came to office. 1.5 million permanent residents, 20% of the Canadian, imagine, in proportionate terms, that would be 15 million new green cards in the United States over the course of 6 years, representing what is the highest per capita level of immigration in the developed world. 20% of the Canadian population is foreign-born. 59% of the new permanent residents that came in the past several years were, quotes, visible minorities, and most of them, the vast majority of them, about half of them from, actually, excuse me, 2/3 were visible minorities, 59% came from Asia. So this is a huge and irreversible part of Canadian society. About 50% of the population of the city of Vancouver are people of Asian origin. Having said all of that, I did intimate in my speech that I want to be very careful about reinforcing the generally positive public attitude towards immigration. I'm very intentional about wanting to avoid the kind of backlash that we've seen in Western Europe, for example. And I think the way that we renew public support for immigration is to demonstrate, A, that immigration is working for the country, that it's a net economic benefit, and B, that our system is based on the rule of law and the consistent application of fair rules, that it's a system with integrity. And those are the two guiding principles of our reforms. As I mentioned, there's a lot of data to suggest that actually, in terms of net fiscal transfers, immigration represents a net cost, at least in the first generation, to Canadians. And so that's why we're radically trying to improve the selection of people who actually have relevant human capital so that they do better and contribute more net to the Canadian economy. Secondly, that's also why we're reinforcing the integrity of the system. You should understand, I'm the first Canadian immigration minister since we started consistent levels of high immigration in the 1960s. I'm the first one who's willing to actually talk publicly about these things. The public discourse in Canada on immigration used to be a kind of Pollyannish repetition of cliches about immigration and diversity are our greatest strength. And there were very strong political incentives not to discuss some of the shortcomings or weaknesses, lack of integration, economic failure in too many cases, integrity problems in the system. And when I began talking about these things 5 years ago, when I began to say something like, there is a duty, there's a duty on newcomers to integrate, I thought I was going to self-immolate, given the kind of thick political correctness that characterized the debates on immigration and integration in Canada. But amazingly, I found a huge resonant public consensus that agreed. And what we find is that new Canadians tend to be the strongest constituency in favor of immigration reform. In fact, new Canadians are more likely to say that we should reduce immigration levels than native-born Canadians. Why? Because they're competing for scarce jobs, often in the bottom of the labor market. And certainly new Canadians are far more likely to support our pro-integrity measures, streamlined removal of foreign criminals, cracking down on abuse of our asylum system, and so forth. So what to some delicate liberal ears may sound like some kind of dog whistle message on my part is actually broadly supported in the Canadian public, especially amongst immigrant communities. If I could get just a little bit political, I'll say that 20% of our population is foreign-born. While I've been going through this kind of very difficult, tricky work, dancing on the third rail of immigration politics in Canada, concurrent with that, my party, the Conservative Party, has become the party of choice of new Canadians. For the first time in our modern history, my party won the significant plurality of the votes of immigrants to Canada in the last election. So I really relish the fact that we've been able to move beyond a kind of politically correct bromides in our immigration debate. I hope that stirs things up a bit here, guys.
Kelly Murdoch, I'm a research fellow here at Stanford, and I guess in the spirit of full disclosure, I'm from the Comox Valley.
You're from Comox?
Yeah. Are there any plans to sort of step up efforts to reach out to the sort of thousands of Canadians here on H-1Bs and especially TN visas who, as I'm sure you're probably aware, took advantage of the fine public education system before moving down here?
I think the answer is no. We sort of take a passive attitude, don't we, as Canadians towards our diaspora, and we estimate there's something like 300,000 Canadians in the Bay Area alone. I think we estimate about, 1.82 million Canadians in the U.S., Cassie? The whole range of people who moved down here decades ago to those who are just here as temporary residents. But let me tell you about one interesting initiative. There's a group called the C100, which are some of the leading Canadians in particularly in the IT industry in the Bay Area. Many of them successful entrepreneurs, others venture capitalists, and others senior executives at major corporations down here. They started really getting organized 3 or 4 years ago to help promote Canada. And they've done an amazing job of helping to leverage $500 million in capital investment in Canadian startups in the last 2 years alone. And promoting joint ventures between Canadian and U.S. VenCap firms. And they're thrilled about this new startup visa. So there is, I think, a lot of those, I call them the brain drain Canadians that left sort of 2 to 3 decades ago, are now starting to realize that the wheel has turned, that the Canadian economy is stronger than that of the United States. The tax rates are lower, the incentives are greater, and they've got something to sell. So, so in that sense, there are some efforts on the part of civil society, individuals, spontaneously to kind of promote going back to or investing in Canada. But in terms of the students and the people who've just come down here for 6 months or 6 or 12 months, I don't think that, the expectation I think for them is they'll see what their opportunities are here. Hopefully many will come back.
Hi, my name is Yujia. So my family actually immigrated to Canada in 2004, so thank you, Jason. So I studied in my high school and undergrad in Ontario and now studying at Stanford. So just wondering if there a particular industry or sector that Canada is focusing on, either it's healthcare or high tech, clean tech, and would that influence the startup visa applicants?
Very good. Where'd you go to high school in Canada, in Ontario?
Which university?
Oh, very good.
Queen's University, sorry.
Okay. The answer is that I anticipate most of the immigrants we welcome through the startup visa will be in STEM industries, particularly in IT, because that's really where the venture capital industry, and we're giving the VenCap funds and angel investors sort of the power to nominate these individuals. So typically, I think they'll be in, broadly speaking, IT startups. But it doesn't have to be that. They can be biomedical and in other areas as well. Overall, we don't believe in economic planning, so we don't privilege certain industries over others. As a general comment, I'll say, I think Canada's fortunate to have a very diversified economy. Of course, we have a tremendous natural resource wealth, which is about to leverage a new boom in our commodities and extractive industries, from iron ore in Labrador to they call it the Plan Nord, the like hard minerals, in northern Quebec as well as northern Ontario, potash and uranium, Saskatchewan, diamonds and other minerals in the north, the oil sands in northern Alberta. Shale gas all across the country. So there's this huge, we're talking about tens and tens of billions of dollars of construction and development in the extractive industries, typically in northern Canada, which will quite frankly continue to be the core of our economy. As much as we'd like to pretend to be, a kind of virtual high-tech economy, we want to diversify in that direction, but we shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that we've got that natural strength in the commodities industries. Our services sector does very well. One sector that's been having difficulty in the past few years, of course, is manufacturing, but we're starting to see some signs of turning that around. I guess what this visa is about is really trying to accelerate the growth, the significant growth that we've seen in STEM-related startups in the past few years. That is associated with increasing investments in R&D at our universities. So, yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give. All right. Well, that looks like it. Well, thank you very much. I hope that this worthwhile Canadian initiative wasn't too boring. And I want to thank you for your interest and we seem to have, I guess, a big chunk of the Canadian club at Stanford here. Your homeland beckons. We hope you come back and have a great summer in Canada and that you stay when you're done your studies here. And help create wealth and a bright future for Canadians. Thank you very much.